Välkomna till Kalmar domkyrka och till en konsert från USA med organisten Nathan Laube. Vi är väldigt glada över att få lyssna på den här konserten från Buffalo. Och här har vi Nathan som ska berätta lite om sig själv som organist och om lite olika intryck av svensk och tysk och amerikansk orgelkonst, olika saker. Very welcome, Nathan. We are delighted to have you as a recitalist from the other side of the world to us in Sweden and here in Kalmar Cathedral. You are going to play a recital for us in Buffalo, and it will be broadcasted in the 11th of April at 6 p.m. And I have a few questions for you.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a bit about your education, how you learned to play the organ? I know you have been in different countries. Can you tell me something about the importance of the different traditions you have studied during your education?
Yeah, surely. I think the diversity of the educational experience I had was very much part of the richness of it. And of course, I was born just north of Chicago, so that's home for me. And I was very lucky as a child already then to have a wonderful piano teacher who was meticulous and really demanded a lot of me, but who's also really a very natural musical person who, gave me a lot of very fundamental skills of music making. And it was from there on that I started also studying the organ. But I think for me also what was very important was always having the organ and the piano next to each other and being aware of the expressive potential of each instrument and how they informed each other. Because of course, especially for example, like the music I'll be playing for you in this program, having a sense of the expressive vocabulary of the piano is so important for the 19th century literature that's written for the organ or in fact for the orchestra. And from there, I went on to the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, and that was a fabulous experience. It's a really rigorous institution, very competitive in some ways, but it's very small. So there's also a feeling of it being sort of a family. It was a very nurturing place to study. And I studied organ there with Alan Morrison. And one of the peculiarities of the organ pedagogy at Curtis is that every week we were expected in our studio class to perform a new piece from memory, which meant in the course of the year you had to perform 28 pieces of organ repertoire by heart. And that was just sort of a normal thing for us. I think the earlier you start memorizing, of course, the less you worry about it, the less you think about it. And so it was a wonderful way to absorb an enormous amount of repertoire on the one hand, and develop that tool, which I think especially, if you're endeavoring in some way or another to end up on the stage is a very valuable one to have when so many audiences are accustomed to seeing violinists or pianists come out on stage without music. On the same time, of course, there can sometimes be a negative part of that, which is that you don't always have as much time to live with a piece and to just let the flavors sort of come together and sit in the refrigerator for a while, which is also important. So it was a remarkably intense period. And it was also during that time that I also studied piano very intensely with Susan Starr, who's a fabulous teacher and a remarkable musician. And I'm so happy I had that experience concurrently, as well as also being an assistant at the Wanamaker organ and therefore submerging myself in the art of transcription making with that particular orchestral instrument, which was a unique and really rich experience. So I think what was so fabulous for me about the Philadelphia time was the diversity of the experience and dipping my feet into so many different pools. Also working as an accompanist, all of these different things. It was really, really fantastic. But I always knew that I wanted to go study in Europe. And a lot of people said, why don't you apply for a Fulbright grant? And you love French organ music, go to Paris, go study there. And this is what I did. I ended up going to Toulouse to study with Michel Bouvard and Jan Willem Janssen, which was also a remarkable experience. Working with Michel and Jan was spectacular and eye-opening, and equally important to that was having access to the collection of instruments there, the famous Cava École at Saint-Sernin, every night practicing. And it was on that organ actually that I transcribed one of the pieces you'll hear today, the List Les Préludes, an experience I'll never forget. And all of the other organs, the Puget organs, the French Baroque organs in that city and in the region. And I had a very, very dear friend there, Jean-Claude Guidarini, with whom I would travel all over the south of France visiting organs. This just became a habit for us. He was a real character. Sadly, in 2020, on Good Friday, he passed away. And but we were very good friends. And it was very much thanks to Jean-Claude that I had, I think, a particularly rich experience of discovering such an enormous wealth of instruments, particularly in the south of France. And then it was maybe within the first weeks of my time in Toulouse that almost the entire organ department from Stuttgart came to visit with Ludger Lohmann, at that time Bernhard Haas also, Jun Laukvik, and all the students. And I met them very, very early on. And I thought, you know, this experience already has been so rich, even though I've only been here a few weeks. Wouldn't it be a pity not to extend this and also have a similar experience in Germany? And that's exactly what I did, continuing in Stuttgart with Ludger Lohmann to do my master's degree there. And in this way, yeah, it was 3 years in Europe to actually escape a little bit my recital career and the pressures of that, and being able to be a little bit in a learning sanctuary away from all the stresses of performing and having to be under the microscope and everybody, you know, but just being able to enjoy playing beautiful organs and thinking a lot about music that I hadn't had such an opportunity to study in Philadelphia, where we played mostly 19th and 20th century music, but to really be able to delve into earlier periods of literature, and the techniques associated with them, and of course experience all the authentic sonorities that informs that repertoire. A very, very wonderful experience. And I have to say that also continued immediately thereafter when I started teaching at Eastman. You never stop learning, and teaching also, and learning how to teach was also one of the best learning experiences I had. It makes you think about things in a completely different way when you realize sometimes how much of your own instincts you take for granted, and when you have to really explain the essence of something in very clear terms to someone who hasn't had those experiences. So it always continues, in short.
Yeah, thank you. So now you're teaching yourself. You have been teaching a lot for many years now, and you are now living in Stuttgart as an organ teacher there. And you have been teaching at Eastman School of Music in Rochester, US. And would you say can you say something about the differences or similarities between the teaching system or tradition in the different countries? Have you experienced any differences?
Sure.
By approaching the music and yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, like everything in our world right now, I think some of those differences are becoming less noticeable as more people are studying overseas. I mean, we saw that so much in the last 50 years in the States, so many people traveling, especially to France, I think. The US has a particular magnetism to France. But there are certain differences, I think. I was very lucky the 7 wonderful years I taught at Eastman. I was very lucky to be within a program that I think had in some ways a certain European ethos that resonated very much with the experiences that I had had as a student in Europe. But of course, still an institution which is training students above all to be, you know, successful musicians in the United States, where you, of course, you have to integrate into a very particular church culture, and to be able to be a successful musician within the sort of economic realities of how art works in the United States. So it was a fabulous experience, but we were very lucky there to have a lot of facsimile style European instruments, which allowed us to approach music with a lot of the same considerations that one would do for example, if you were here in Stuttgart or if you were in Sweden or wherever. And so I think some of the differences that had formerly existed that were very, very obvious, maybe 50 years ago between European and American pedagogy have all become lessened as, let's say, maybe the objectives of organ teaching have become more globalized. Everybody is interested nowadays in the instruments which inspire the repertoire. Everyone is interested in some way or another with, the particularities of performance practice and all these sort of things. One of the things that I always loved doing also at Eastman was working with various elements of liturgical organ playing that had to do with oftentimes the requirements of being a successful church musician in the United States, leading a choir from the console and playing big anthems and conducting them at the same time, and the peculiarities of managing a big American organ in a church context and all these sort of things. I love doing that. And sadly, I don't have an opportunity to actually play church very often anymore, but that was something I really enjoyed teaching, as well as transcriptions and some of those things which maybe are particularly in vogue in the States right now. But we've also seen very much take on in Europe as well. I've only been here now in Stuttgart for maybe half a year. And of course, it's a very different Stuttgart that I remember as a student, because we're all locked down and we can't even at the moment teach in the Hochschule. But I think what I've noticed is that the American educational system is extremely formalized. There's a lot of structure in it, and there's a huge amount of coursework, and I don't know, things are very regulated in a certain way. And I think here things are just a little bit more relaxed. That's always been my experience. And this works for different students in different ways, positive and negative. Some students anyway need more structure. Other students need a lot of freedom to pursue their interests. And I think maybe that's something I'm looking forward to exploring and getting to know is how you can manage that and how you can help direct students who need a lot more flexibility, a lot more breathing room. And then those, of course, who need a lot of structure and a lot of rigor that helps really funnel all of their artistic creativity into something really meaningful. So I think, after having been in a place that was very institutionalized, I can already tell this is a little bit more relaxed. But of course, each has its advantages and its disadvantages. So there is, as a very wise man once said, no one has the monopoly on wisdom. So, we can always just, work with the certain parameters we have and to try to do something good.
You have been in Sweden quite a lot. You have been playing here, you have been teaching here. It would be interesting to hear something about your thinking about Swedish organs, your impressions, Swedish organ culture and the instruments. What have you seen? What are your impressions about it?
Yes, well, I mean, very much thanks to you, Jan. I've had the opportunity to visit a lot of the most beautiful organs in the country. I'm just thinking of Lufstabruck and the beautiful Strand organ near Kalmar, and of course the organs in Göteborg, the beautiful Markussen organ I love so much at the Haga Church, and Göteborg, of course, has so many, among others. And there's still so much to see. I think one of the amazing things about the time in which we're living now is, having spent the better part of the last century investigating, let's say, all the organs that have such a specific corresponding repertoire, the organs of North Germany, the organs of Middle Germany, the organs of France, etc. I think it's really wonderful that all of a sudden there's this huge fascination with the organs that might not have such a central repertoire that we play all the time, but are just really beautiful organs. I think all of a sudden people are interested in all these organs in Poland and in Lithuania and in Sweden and Norway. I mean, all these instruments which are all over the place, which Bach may not have played, but all of a sudden we can just experience them and appreciate them for the fact that they're extremely interesting, beautiful organs of their time that represent a important aesthetic. And what I've even noticed that is all of a sudden, a lot of Europeans are also interested in 19th and 20th century American organs, which is also a sort of new phenomenon. So you see it from both sides. So yes, I've loved coming to get to know the Swedish instruments that I've seen, and I really look forward to visiting more. I know we have a long list of organs we've assembled that we're going to go see at some point, and I really look forward to that. But yeah, it's clearly a very, very rich landscape, and one that I really look forward to getting to know even better. But what I've seen, of course, has been spectacular. So
you are going to play a grand organ in Buffalo for us, the Hook and Hastings from 1876, was it?
That's right, yeah.
Can you tell us something about it, the instrument?
Yeah, it is certainly one of the most important organs to be built on American soil in the 19th century, and it was in many ways a landmark organ. It's impossible not to speak of the 19th century and organ building without mentioning World's Fairs. For example, the famous 1851 Great Exhibition in London, at which so many important organs were exhibited, 55 in Paris, famously 78 in Paris with the Trocadero organ, and 76 in Philadelphia with this Hook and Hastings organ. And I think it was the first time the United States had hosted an international World's Fair, and it was to commemorate 100 years of the founding of the country. So of course it happened in Philadelphia. And Hook and Hastings got the commission to build a very important and powerful organ, and it was in an enormous room. So it had to be a very impressive organ to fill that space. And organs before the 1870s in the United States tended to be rather genteel, rather dulcet. Even if they had quite large scales, they were all on very low wind pressure, and the impression of them was simply that they could be extremely beautiful, but they were not big. They could not in any way compete with what was happening in terms of pure decibels in the UK or in Paris, for example. And an instrument that probably also showed that was when in 1863, the big Walker organ from Ludwigsburg was brought over to Boston for the music hall. And keep in mind that Hook and Hastings was based in Boston, and they did not get the contract to build the big organ in Boston. It was this big Walker. So I think there was a spirit of, we need to really rise to the occasion and build a very impressive organ for the Philadelphia exposition. And that's exactly what happened. Boston, in the 1870s, Francis Hastings joined the ENGG Hook Company, and it became Hook and Hastings. And that was the moment where all of a sudden the Hook sound became much more spacious and glorious. They started importing reeds, for example, from Henri Zimmermann in Paris, who also supplied reeds to Cavaillé-Coll. And for example, the big organ just before the one that you'll hear today was for Holy Cross Cathedral in Boston. A giant space by the same architect who built the cathedral in Buffalo, Patrick Keeley. And for that room, it was sort of their test run for the organ they had to build the next year for Philadelphia. So they really built a monumental organ with extremely complex choruses, with things they probably borrowed from Notre-Dame, septièmes and the mixtures and things like this. Big 16/8 and 4-foot reeds on the grate, which was very unusual at the States at that time, and a high-pressure tuba mirabilis. So this was clearly an organ that was going to set a new tone for organ building in the late 19th century, and the success of it, which was widely hailed, I think probably gave them a lot of confidence for what they had to do in Philadelphia. So the organ in Philadelphia was installed and apparently was very impressive, and people could even walk through it so that they could appreciate the industry behind it. And then after the convention, it was disassembled and it was purchased for the new Patrick Keeley Cathedral in Buffalo, and it was installed there shortly thereafter. And you can imagine that this was an organ built originally to fill a much larger space, and then it was in a big limestone cathedral that probably seats just over 1,000 people. And I can tell you that it is a big sound. It is really thrilling in the room. The open wood 16 in the pedal is absolutely monumental. The tuba, the effect of it in that room is overwhelming. So it must have been yet, even after the Boston Cathedral, another another big moment for American organ building at that time, putting it sort of on the same level as what was going on the European continent. So it's an organ I've loved getting to know, and I'm always so impressed by the subtlety of the colors, as well, of course, as the thrilling tutti. So I really look forward to sharing it with you.
Wonderful. And the music, can you say something about the program, the pieces you are going to play?
There are 2 single pieces on the program by Saint-Saëns and Liszt, 2 composers who had mutual admiration for each other. And the first work is the Fantasy in D flat, Opus 101 by Camille Saint-Saëns, which I think is a singularly poetic work in the repertoire. Also that maybe shows Saint-Saëns as using an organ in a different way than, let's say, all the Lemons tradition students like Widor and Guillemot, who developed such a prescriptive and kind of standardized way of registering. Here you really have the impression that Saint-Saëns sits down at the Madeleine and goes through stops one by one and just revels in the poetry of each individual flute and string, and oh, now I'll take my cor anglais, and now I'll take my viol, etc. It's very, very poetic writing, and also very clearly orchestrally inspired, with different groups of instrumentalists playing in dialogue with each other. So a very special piece. And it also uses the organ just so well, all these particular effects. So this is the first piece on the program. The second work is a transcription that I made by Franz Liszt, and it is his first symphonic poem, Les Préludes. And an unusual work in that he wrote the piece before he actually became acquainted with the poem by Lamartine that he later affixed to the tone poem. Usually with this sort of programmatic music, it starts by reading something or seeing something or hearing something that inspires you to write music. And curiously, in this case, he wrote a piece that just happened to correspond very well to this poem that he later read, which was called Les Préludes. And a very, very evocative piece, beginning in total darkness, and of course growing into a work that is once heraldic and glorious in its exaltation, as well as having beautiful moments of poetry, again using all the soft stops of the organ. And in this piece, you'll also have an opportunity to hear this famous tuba mirabilis that's so spectacular on this organ, one of the first in the United States, as well as the free reed stops, the strings that are so beautiful, every manner of flute. It really goes through the organ top to bottom. So yeah, I look forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nathan. We are really looking forward to hear you play these pieces in Buffalo.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. See you soon.
Indeed, I look forward. Ciao.
Bye.